The topic for today I'll be addressing is called burnout. I also like to weave into that same question the point of compassion fatigue. It's been a question that's been around for a long time, but I think the COVID situation has really highlighted it, especially for medical professionals. I want to also make sure that we don't just think that this happens to medical professionals. As we're taping this week, earlier in the week there was a news report that about half of teachers are really experiencing this same phenomenon, are probably not going to go back to teaching again once things go back to normal, however we want to define normal. So we need to really take seriously these issues in our own lives, because if our medical professionals quit and our education people are not going to come back, I think as a society we're going to be in pretty sad shape. I will probably use synonymously burnout and compassion fatigue, but to start off this session, let me just give you some thoughts here about the two, how they are different. In my estimation, burnout really comes from the stresses we experience in our work environment. Work environment that is not conducive for us to get our job done, whether that again be in a hospital or school or whatever our place of work. There isn't really a whole lot that I can give in terms of changing that phenomenon, but at the same time, I think being aware of what's going on in your work environment can help us with that question. Here are some signs, and I took this from a professor at the University of Tennessee, who gave kind of an outline of where can we start identifying whether we're experiencing burnout from our work environment. If we find ourselves cranky and irritable, we come late and leave early, we just can't stand to be in the workplace, we have no enthusiasm, no passion, we have to drag our butts out of bed in the morning to go to work, we avoid fellow workers, they can't stand them. Even physically, we experience tiredness and headaches, sleeplessness. I think if you and I experience those kind of things, we really need to take seriously whether the place we're working is a work environment that's conducive for us to be involved in our care for others. As we look at the signs and the symptoms of burnout and compassion fatigue, the next logical question for us to ask is, what's the cause of either one of those, especially burnout? I think the standard answer most people give, well, burnout is a result we work way too much work. I'm not sure that's true. A number of authors that I looked at also talked about this question. For example, Dr. Horace Mayo, quoted in the Washington Post, said, "I've never known anyone who died from overwork, but many who have died from doubt." Even Buckminster Fuller is known for the geodesic dome, worked many hours. He'd work 20 hours a day, and he just said, I just love it. So it's not that we burn out or have compassion fatigue from doing too much or working too hard. I think what Dr. Mayo said is really right on target. I've known many who died from doubt. And I would say doubt means there is no sense of purpose, lower satisfaction, a sense of frustration, powerlessness, don't achieve any goals. In light of that, what I believe we all need to have, and it's just again very much part of human nature, is we need to have a payoff, a motivation, something that drives us, gives us a passion to do what we do. I, for example, love woodworking, and I can't find enough time. I just love woodworking. I don't burn out, I don't have compassion fatigue, but I also have a payoff from my woodworking. You can look at payoff in a number of different ways, motivation. Number one is literally a payoff. I may go to work at the aircraft factory because I need a paycheck. I gotta have some money. I gotta keep roof overhead and food on the table. But is that the highest driving force in our lives? Is that the greatest motivation? I don't think so. Maybe a second level is appreciation. So I do something for somebody, open the door, and what I would expect is thank you. Appreciation for doing that. Now, that's a minor example. But if I'm involved with a client, for example, a patient of mine, and I do something for them, more likely than not, they will say thank you. They'll appreciate my efforts, but it doesn't happen automatically. One illustration of that is very clear from the COVID issue that we're dealing with right now. When it first started and the healthcare workers were out there doing whatever they could to support people, often in dying situations. They were heroes. We saw on the hospital campuses, heroes work here. What's happened in the course of 2+ years? Now the healthcare workers are villains. They're not appreciated. And I think that's a source of anger, frustration. A lot of people said, well, the heck with it. I'm not going to do this anymore if you're not going to appreciate me. So that's not the highest level of payoff either, the highest level of motivation. I think the highest level really comes from a sense of satisfaction. Knowing that I've helped someone, I've made a difference, that's a great payoff. And that'll keep me coming back. And I want to keep doing it because there is that sense of purpose, sense of satisfaction. I was reminded as I was reflecting on these questions in terms of the payoff. And in our culture, let's face it, we think that the highest motivator for me is the largest, the greatest amount of money I can make. People would often reflect on that question and get a little cynical, as I said earlier, about, oh, I just hate going to work, but I need the payoff, I need the check. But how much do we need? When does greed kick in? Those of you familiar with Simon and Garfunkel might remember a very plaintive song that they had out. This is now in the 70s. I can't give you the exact date for this particular song. But the song is Richard Cory. And they give you some of the verses. They say that Richard Cory owns 1/2 of this old town with elliptical connections to spread his wealth around. And I work in his factory. And oh, I wish I could be Richard Cory with all his money. So much to my surprise, I read the morning headline that Richard Cory had put a bullet through his head. It's pretty powerful. The melody is pretty plaintive. So in effect, in terms of satisfaction, purpose, that wasn't enough for Richard Cory. And I think so many of us in our time and place will have that same question that we need to ask and answer for ourselves. What is our purpose? We ask also the question over and over again, am I happy? It's the wrong question to ask in my estimation. What is happiness? I think if you pursue it directly, you're often going to be frustrated too. My own take is that if I find purpose and satisfaction, happiness will follow. So that begins to answer that issue for me. Going on now, a little slightly different vein of reflection here. We need to have a balance, there's no question in my mind about this, between care for ourselves and care for others. Self-care becomes very, very important. In effect, and I'll touch on this later too, if I don't take care of myself, I cannot take care of anyone else. So there needs to be that balance. And the two words that I really like, that I think sum up this balance that I'm talking about, are the words empathy and sympathy. For the most part, we use them synonymously. But I've asked people over and over again, well, even though we use them synonymously, let me ask your take on that. How would you define the difference? And often what people come up with is that sympathy really zeroes in more on myself, and empathy zeroes in on the other, which is really right on target. And the other thing we do is that sympathy often comes out with pity. That word used also with sympathy. I love word study, finding the derivation of words, their root meanings. And both sympathy and empathy have the same basic root meaning, pathos. And the Greek word means the core of one's being, what's really in the depths of where I am. And you can talk about that as emotion or feeling. The difference in the two words comes from the prefix. Empathy, the prefix is in the Greek, in, and we use that common saying, empathy means you walk in another's shoes. You expend energy for another. You feel their pain, what they're going through. Sympathy, seen within, speaks to walking in our own shoes, that we expend energy on ourselves. And I caution you immediately, don't immediately say one is positive and one is negative. It's the balance again. In order for me to be able to connect with you, I must first connect with myself and take care of myself. You can't love others unless you first love yourself. You can't care for others if you don't care for yourself. One of my favorite spiritual writers is Henry Nouwen, and he has a delightful, powerful book called The Wounded Healers. Wounded Healers. And he talks about this sense of woundedness that is part and parcel of human existence. And the story he uses to illustrate his point, what occurs right immediately, talks about a beggar sitting at the city gates. And this beggar has wounds, and he's constantly wrapping and unwrapping his wounds. So someone asked him, why are you always constantly wrapping and unwrapping your wounds? And he said, well, yeah, I am doing that. If I'm going to reach out to others, I need to have my wounds bound up. So I have the physical capability of doing that. But at the same time, if I keep those wounds tightly wrapped and don't allow healing remedies and the sun and fresh air to get to that, they're going to fester, they're going to get worse. So I have to unwrap the wounds in order for them to have the opportunity for healing. But once I've unwrapped the wounds, I'm incapable of reaching out. So it's that balance again that is being talked about when you use the expression wounded healers. I often ask medical professionals, since they're often involved with physiological issues, ask them the question, to what organ must the heart first pump blood? And answers come up different ways. Well, to the brain. Then they start thinking more and more, and I just challenging them, are you sure? And finally they'll come up with, well, I guess to itself. It stands to reason, if the heart doesn't take care of itself, what's going to happen to the heart? It's also going to fade away, not being able to do the pumping to take care of the other organs. So before, in effect, the brain can have any kinds of care, the heart must have that care for itself and pump the blood to the brain. There's also, I think, the importance of the reciprocity that's involved. The heart, yes, takes care of itself first, but if it doesn't get any oxygen, then what? So it also needs the lungs to get itself that oxygen. It needs the brain to give it signals. It needs the kidneys to remove the toxins. Excuse me. So there is that reciprocity that's involved, even in the physical functioning of our bodies. I think that same reciprocity has to be applied in the interaction we have with one another. One of the ways that I feel very strongly about in terms of avoiding this sense of burnout and compassion fatigue is being aware of how we can get energized from the interaction with others. And that's where the word hospitality is so very important. Again, bear with me as I give you the origin of that word. It's no longer Greek, but we're talking about Latin now. The Latin word for hospitality is hospes, hospitis. We have lots of English words in that same context. Hospitality is not just the only one, but even words like host, hospital, hospice, all have the same basic root word connected with it. When we think of hospitality, for example, we think, well, it's my reaching out to the other person. Yes, that's true. But what we have to remember is when I take care of the other person, I'm also receiving care from that other person. That's the reciprocity. I grew up in North Dakota on a farm, pretty isolated, illustrating this point that I experienced even as a youngster. And being out there in the middle of nowhere, you think western Kansas is isolated. You ought to go to western North Dakota. There's really not much there. And one of the things we really enjoyed, you might guess, is having visitors. If we were out on the prairie and there was a cloud of dust on those dirt roads, we were desperately hoping as kids that someone would come to our home. It could be a salesman coming at noontime. And what would we do? If we were eating lunch, they usually timed it. They were invited right to the table. Why would we be so excited about them coming, maybe to even sell us something? Because they enriched our lives too by coming. We took care of them, but their visit enriched us. They took care of us. Even a better example is how strong this concept of hospitality is for the Near Eastern cultures. I was visiting with a fellow professor, and I'm still in university work in Israel. So one day we decided we didn't want to go to the regular tourist kind of outlets, and we enlisted a taxi cab driver. And we negotiated so much a day. He turned off the fare. He was our guide then for the day. And he said, well, what do you want to see? And he said, well, we've seen the usual places, but there's some out of the ordinary places that they don't have tourists come to on all of these tours. And he said, yeah. And he says, do you want to go out to the desert? Well, it didn't take you long to get into the desert. He said, sure. So So now he's explaining to us all of the environment. There was a Bedouin camp. This is, I believe, 1979 I was over there. And he explained the culture of the Arabs, the Bedouin. And he said, see those tents over there? And there's the big tent, the main one, that's where the sheik stays. And he said, I'm an Israeli, you're Americans. They might not necessarily like us, but if we got there, they would be very careful to practice hospitality. As you got there, they would give you a very bitter cup of coffee, so bitter you could almost not drink it. Okay, so you visit a while and they bring some grand foods out and you enjoy that. Then before you leave, they serve you another cup, maybe a cup of tea that would be so sweet it would almost be like drinking sugar water. And the sheik would say as you left, life before you got here was like this bitter cup of coffee. But now that you've been here and enriched me with your company, my life is now like this really, really sweet cup of tea. That's reciprocity. That's hospitality. Can we get that into our minds in terms of the clients we work with, whether that be students, whether that be patients, whether that be residents in our facilities, that they are also enriching us. I make it a point, and I say this absolutely to the truth, I never ever leave in my hospice work a patient setting with family, whether that be in a nursing home, whether that be in a home setting, because payoff family will say, thank you, you've really helped me through this situation. But the other thing that they will also need to know is that they have enriched my life, this sense of reciprocity. So I always tell them, thank you for the honor and the privilege of being with you. You opened your home to me, you opened your heart to me. My life is richer for this encounter with you. That's again the balance. Going back to sympathy and empathy here again. If I have things going on, I'm wounded, for example, having death in my own life, using the illustration of my mother dying, for example, when I started hospice work, and very suddenly unexpected, that affected me, and I had to know that. I had to be in touch with that issue, that agenda of my loss, my grief. But I have to put that on hold when I would go out there with families who are dealing also with loss and grief. I can't directly say, well, my mother died, please take care of me. No, that would be really unethical and unprofessional for that to happen. So I would need to balance again sympathy, take care of myself in order that I could now take care of others. There's also been used the illustration of having woundedness as being down in the pits, and we use that. I just feel low, I'm down in the pits, I have compassion fatigue. And so here I am, I've been down in the pit, say, a month ago, and I know it's terrible, cold, muddy, dark. And so now I've gotten out of the pit and I'm walking along and I see somebody else down there. And I said, oh, that person is so lonely, I better help them. And so I jump into the pit. What do you have now in the pit? 2 people are miserable. But if I've healed enough from my loss, my woundedness, that I now can stay out of that situation and consider the other, rather than jumping down the pit, I might tie a rope to the tree, throw it down there, and pull that person out. That's empathy now, moving sympathy to empathy. Closing out my reflections here, we need to have all this balance in our lives. What I've used here in terms of the heart needing to pump blood to itself first, we take care of ourselves first before taking care of others. Rather than seeing our clients, whoever that client might be, as I said earlier, from a student to a patient to a resident, rather than seeing them as sucking the energy out of us, and we use that expression, maybe it's a lot better for us to say, this work energizes me. It gives me that passion for me to keep coming back and helping these others. But to repeat myself, I can guarantee you it's not going to happen. We cannot help others until we are able to take care of ourselves. And when we take care of ourselves and others, that's where satisfaction comes in. Thank you for your kind attention here. I would wish you only the best, that you too are energized by your work and that you continue to help others, because there's a lot of people in our world that need a lot of help, a lot of care.